session will have a total of 10 minutes of questions and answers. You can send your questions at any time during the presentation using the chat box. Please remain muted unless you need to speak. And whenever you speak, please identify yourself by name to help others recognize you. And remember that you'll receive your certificate within 10 to 15 labor days. Now, I am very glad to present to you Tyson Seburn. He is a master's in EdTech at TESOL, University of Manchester. He is a lecturer and assistant director of an EAP Foundation year at the University of Toronto and a tutor on Oxford TEFL Barcelona's Trinity the Department TESOL course. He has recently volunteered on local and international teacher association committees as IATEFL, TDSIG coordinator. His personal and professional experiences inspired his interest in queer and racialized ELT experiences and thus ways to better practices and materials. He discusses critical and inclusive pedagogies via his online spaces. He is the author of Academic Reading Circles in 2015 and How to Write Inclusive Materials in 2021. He will be presenting the topic We're Not Only About Pronouns. Welcome, the space is yours.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Sound is okay, I'm assuming? Yes? Great.
Yes.
So hi, everybody. First of all, thanks so much for inviting me. I have to admit, when I first got the invitation and I heard it was in Bolivia, I was suddenly kind of excited because I thought I might be invited to come to Bolivia. Obviously, that didn't work out. It's an online thing, and that's obviously much more cost effective. But I have never been to South America, actually, so I thought it would be a really cool time to go. But c'est la vie. So I'm going to be talking to you today about something that is sensitive in some ways to some people and certainly controversial to others. As language teachers, we do come across a wide variety of identities in the classroom, not to mention the identities of the teachers in the classroom as well. And so today I want to talk to you about how language impacts the identities and the feelings of the peoples in the classrooms that you may or may not already be aware of. And so my talk today is we are not only about pronouns, because pronouns, when we talk about a certain identity, specifically the queer community, pronouns does seem to be the prolific aspect of language that we tend to hear talked about, you know, using they, them, or he, him, or you can see on my profile picture, you can see my pronouns are there. But I wanted to talk about how pronouns are just one aspect of language that we need to consider when we're looking at inclusive practices. What you'll see is a QR code on this slide that you can feel free to open at any time, and it has a list of references that I'm going to be talking about throughout this presentation, but honestly, a long variety of other references that are with regards to inclusive practices that just come up in talks that I'm going to do. Oops. So I've divided this into three parts. Primarily, we're going to take a look at a sort of brief historical recap of how language evolves over time. And when I say brief, I mean brief. Like, I'm really going to over-summarize this whole aspect of language evolution. But I think it's important to contextualize. The second part is a big part of the talk, where I want to take a look at some inclusive and exclusive types of questions that we can think about as language teachers or language teaching professionals with regards to how language impacts different types of identities. And hopefully, after I give you some examples, we may not see language quite the same way after today. So sorry about that, or hooray. And then finally, why does this matter to us, actually, right? Why am I even talking about all of these things, these pronouns, this language inclusivity, marginalized identities? I'm just a language teacher and I'm just trying to teach people how to get by in English. Why does this matter to me? So I'm going to try to make a case for that at the end as well. Okay. First of all, if we jump into the brief historical recap part of the talk, when we take a look at language and how language gets used and evolves over time, we can see that language sometimes becomes kind of obsolete or out of fashion, and we start to stop using it or we use it in a different way. And I thought I'm going to just give you 3 kind of brief examples of what that kind of looks like. In this comic I thought it was kind of funny because it's showing a little generational gap between a younger person and an older person in terms of what they expect to see or use in terms of machinery, right? So here we've got an older man saying, there's no dial tone on this. And of course, it's a remote control for the television. It's not actually a phone that he's trying to use. But the part of this that actually caught my eye was the word dial tone, or the phrase dial tone. It's something that's in my linguistic repertoire because I grew up in the 80s and 90s when you have the standard telephones and you just pick up the receiver and then you hear that sound, that eep, and then you start typing. But on mobile phones, that sound's no longer there. At least it's not on mine. And so we still refer to this thing called a dial tone, but I think younger people may not actually have any idea what that dial tone is. Another example of a phrase, or I would say an insult, actually, that is barely used, at least here. I'm not sure about Bolivia. You can think about your own context, but is to refer to women drivers. When I was young, and even before that, there was a stigma attached to women who drove, and men, particularly straight white men, would quite often comment about a poor driving ability as, oh, that's just a woman driver. She doesn't know what she's doing, right? We don't really use that kind of language anymore. It's something that's fallen out of fashion based on how society and society views have changed over time. At least in Canada, I can say that. So again, sometimes language that we use either goes out of fashion or it's impacted by social views changing, or maybe just technology even. And then very relevant to me, here's one, an insult that was pretty commonly thrown around when I was a young kid and even a teenager, was to call something gay. And that was to refer to it being stupid or lame or dumb or some kind of, anyway, negative connotation. But in fact, that has been reclaimed a little bit by the community. And so sometimes language falls out of fashion and then it comes kind of back because the people who were impacted by it try to reclaim its power. So there's a very brief introduction to some examples of how language evolves over time. And if I'm going to put this in a kind of, let's say, process, I would argue that there's terms or phrases or expressions, and I'm going to just call that language from now on, that's really commonly used, right? So you can think about anything that you use regularly in your own vocabulary, and how commonly you use it is up to you. But there's these types of expressions. Sometimes those expressions just get continued to be used over time and they don't really evolve. Other times, that language goes through a little bit of a process. It may become something that doesn't refer to anything that exists now, such as the receiver on a telephone or the dial tone, right? So this language sort of becomes a little bit out of date. Another process in a different direction that language might go through is that the language that's used might be questioned or rejected by those who are impacted by it. And so I was giving you an example earlier, you know, women drivers, obviously women are impacted by that type of phrase, and they might question, hey, why are you saying this? Or don't say this type of phrase. Or gay people might say, you know, please don't say gay in a negative way. This is an example of what I'm talking about here. When I'm talking about, however, those who are impacted by it, you might know Sylvia Duckworth's privilege or wheel of power. This shows sort of identities and where on a scale you have different types of privilege. And so if you were to pick out where you fall on each of these different categories, like citizenship or skin color or ability or sexuality and so on, the closer you are to the middle in terms of your identity, the more power you have in society. And therefore, when I'm talking about people who are impacted by the language that's being used, I'm mostly talking about people whose identities end up falling on the sort of outer circle, right? So if you look at gender, for example, the outer circle are trans, intersex, or non-binary people. They're the most marginalized and have the least power in society, at least in a North American sense. And so those are the type of people who I'm referring to as impacted by the language that's being used and therefore questioning it. Once that language is questioned, then what tends to happen in society by and large is that use of language goes through a kind of discussion phase or even a backfire stage. Imagine that I tell you in 1985, saying "that's so gay" is really harmful to the gay community, and you're putting us at risk. You're making us feel less valued and so on by using this phrase. A large group of society may then talk about that and think, oh, is that true? You know, do we need to stop using it? Another group might have a bit of a backfire effect, and they might push back and say, no, it's fine. We don't mean anything bad by the word gay. We're going to continue using it anyway. You know, don't worry about it. Stop being so sensitive, right? That type of discussion tends to happen a lot. And usually it happens among the people who are in the closer to the center of that wheel of power, because they tend to be the majority. So either direction you go, what happens to some of the languages, the language gradually falls out of use, right? So hopefully after that language becomes obsolete, or that language goes through the discussion phase and finally society catches up and listens to the marginalized people, then that language stops being used. So here is my brief introduction to, brief recap into how language evolves over time. So let's move into part 2 then and think about what types of questions can we consider as a society, or more specifically as language professionals, when we're using language with students or really basically anybody. There are 4 questions that I think are particularly relevant in this case for us to think about. The first is, when we look at a piece of language, whose perspective is being centered by that language? And when I say centered, I mean it is taking the space in society. It is the one that is being focused on, right? So you'll hear this word centered kind of talked about a lot when we talk about inclusive language and decolonization and things like that. A second question that works really well, and I'll have to show an example before you really understand it, but that is, does swapping out the language impact your perspective about it? So when I'm talking about swapping out the language, I'm really suggesting that whatever language it is that we're using, that we're questioning whether we should be using it or not, can we exchange that language for something kind of equivalent but opposite, in a sense, to demonstrate whether or not actually it is excluding people or not? And I think that will become clear in a few minutes. Third question is the language that we're examining, is the meaning excluding the experiences of a group of people, yes or no? Right? So can we look at that language and go, this group of people is entirely not included? If so, maybe we should change it. And then finally, do you want these things to happen? Do you want A, B, and C to happen because of the language that you're using? Sometimes you do. Maybe you are deliberately excluding a group of people for some particular reason. And there might be a valid reason for that, but these are the types of questions that we need to consider. So let's take a look at some examples of how this might play out on actual language. And there might be a couple of opportunities for you to give some ideas in the chat box, but we'll see. Okay. First, I thought it would be useful to take a look at how these questions kind of play out on something that isn't really linguistic, something a little bit more visual. And I thought that would be a good starter. I'm going to talk about a North American perspective, of course, because that's where I'm from and that's where I grew up. When you think about South America or Bolivia, and wherever you're from, of course, I want you to translate everything that I'm saying into your own context because you have a better sense of that than I do, of course. Here, when you go to a toy store, there's traditionally an aisle that is meant for girls, and that aisle often has pink toys in it, and quite often Barbie is one of them. Now, Barbie, I'm going to preface this by saying the movie Barbie was great. Everything about that movie really helped change perspective a little bit, I think, about on what Barbie meant. So this is pre-Barbie movie, this picture that I'm going to talk about. So don't relate it to the movie. But what we can see here is a little girl who's looking at all the Barbies on the shelf and trying to select one. Now, when we think about this picture, whoops, whose perspective is being centered by the language in this picture? And in this case, we're not really talking about language, we're sort of talking about Barbie itself. So when we take a look at all of the different Barbies that are available, whose perspective is being centered by that type of Barbie that's there? I want you to think about that. If we swap out this image for an equivalent image that's a little bit opposite, is that going to change our perspective about what we said in part A? Let's try. So here we have an equivalent picture. The same situation is happening. It's a toy store. This time we've got a little girl as well. She's looking at all the different dolls. But we can see that there's a marked difference, obviously, between the type of doll that's available here and the type of doll that's available there. Not to mention the girl that's here and the girl that's there. When we see this picture, it can quite often impact a lot of viewers, especially who identify a little bit like me, at least racially, because we don't often see this kind of image. We more often see this, and there's an invisibility, there's a normalization of whiteness that's included in this picture or in this scenario. And quite often, people then don't recognize that there's even a problem. But when you see this, then it makes a point to people and go, oh my God, my eyes are open. Now I sort of understand what you're talking about. So in this case, we're not swapping out language, but we're swapping out scenario and trying to highlight now whose perspective is being centered by this language and whose was before. Question C, of course, was, does the meaning exclude the experiences of a group of people? When we look at either of these two scenarios, I think it becomes much more obvious that the experiences of the little girl and the life experiences and the lived experiences she has are being excluded by the types of dolls that are available. And then finally, do we really want these things to happen, right? Do we want the little girl to look at the dolls that are available and not see herself? Is that something we're doing on purpose? Well, hopefully not, but sometimes that might be the case. So hopefully that little Barbie image has given you a kind of a food for thought as we go and take a look at actual language situations now. The first one I want to bring up is comes from a TV show called Survivor. It's been on forever, and I don't know if you've watched it or not, or how popular it is where you are. But I've watched every single episode of every single season. It's kind of embarrassing, but that's like 45 seasons. So anyway, I'm quite familiar with it. On this show, the tribe, which is kind of a problematic word also, but anyway, the tribe of people need to compete in challenges. And when they arrive at the challenge, the host over there, he says something every single time. And I don't know if you know what that is or not, but we'll find out. So he sees everybody and he says, "Come on in." What's the word that's missing there? You don't have to say it out loud. It is guys. So every time, no matter who's in that group, he says, "Come on in, guys." And that is the way he opens this challenge. This is an example of language that some people argue is gender neutral. And I want to challenge that. When we ask whose perspective is being centered by this language, the language in this case being guys as a gender neutral term, I would argue that it is men primarily. It is men's perspective that is being centered here. And the reason for that is because we're using the word guys, literally the word guys, to include everybody. Now, you as an identifying woman or a straight woman, you too may actually right now argue that, wait a minute, I use guys myself. I say it to my friends, I say it to my students and everything. I believe it is also a gender neutral thing. And you're welcome to have that opinion. But I would argue that you have been tricked by the patriarchy, if we want to call it that, into believing that a masculine word includes you, when in fact it literally doesn't. So, second question then, does swapping out the language impact your perspective about this word guys? Okay, so if you're a straight guy or a woman and you think that guys is gender neutral, then in theory, the opposite of that should also be gender neutral, right? So let's try. Come on in, girls. How about that? If we say, come on in, girls, instead of come on in, guys, does it have the same feeling to you as being included in this? I would argue that girls, for some reason or other, is not gender neutral in the same way that guys is gender neutral. And as a result, neither of them can actually be gender neutral, right? One is just being so normalized in terms of its use that we have tricked everybody into believing that it is gender neutral. Does the meaning of the word girls exclude a group of people? I'm going to say that most men would probably vehemently say yes. They likely would not like to be called a girl in the same way that girls don't mind being called guys in this scenario. And then, do you want these things to happen because of the language, right? Do you want men to feel like they're not included? No, of course not. Do you want women to feel as though they're not included by using guys? No, of course not. So I think this then suggests that we take the word guys and we think about whether or not that actually is the type of word that we want to continue using in this scenario. Now, I mentioned the sort of process, right? Guys is a really, really common, ubiquitous word that is used in all sorts of scenarios. So it's in common use. Is it going to be obsolete? Well, no. I mean, there's always going to be men out there, so I don't think it's going to be obsolete. Is it being questioned by a certain group of people who are impacted by the word guys? It is. Now, it might not be the largest discussion at the moment, but I right now am questioning the use of the word guys. And I'm somebody who is impacted by it, not even as much as a woman would be in this case. But there is a discussion or a backlash that we're currently going through with regards to this word. And although this word might not be the most, scandalous, or it's kind of a benign word in comparison to some others, there is a discussion by a group of people, and I'm sure even after today, some of you will go to your classrooms, your staff rooms, and you'll talk about, hey, this person Tyson said that guys isn't a gender neutral term. That's just crap, isn't it? I believe there's going to be this kind of backlash even amongst women. I guarantee it. But hopefully, or maybe not hopefully, it depends on who you are, this usage might cease over time, and we might in fact realize that there's a better alternative to the word guys or girls in this particular scenario. And proof of that alone is on the TV show Survivor. They have in fact stopped using the word guys. He just says, come on in, instead of come on in, guys. Another example of this type of marginalization or inclusive practices is something that we see or hear quite often at conferences, and I don't know if we've heard it today or not, but it's the welcoming, ladies and gentlemen, hello, welcome to our talk. This is an example, another one, where we can go through and we can ask those 4 questions. Again, whose perspective is being centered in this case? I would argue that it is binary people, right? Specifically cisgender. And so non-binary or transgender in some cases, people may not feel included in this particular welcome. So ways that we can get around that in terms of asking those 4 questions and then trying to think of a solution. One is to just go general, right? Say, good morning, everyone, right? There, everybody's included because everyone is everyone. We could be specific. At this conference, we could say, good morning, teachers. Good morning, language professionals, right? That includes everybody because that's who we are. But we could also say something a little bit more specific if we love this phrase, ladies and gentlemen. And I know in debates, my friend in France who coaches student debating teams, they have to say ladies and gentlemen. It's just actually this requirement linguistically at the beginning of a debate. And I argued that maybe we can be more specific by saying ladies, gentlemen, and non-binary friends as an example. We could also just go interesting, right? Hey, friends and enemies, how are you doing today? That way we get a removal of this kind of binary system, and we look at ways in which we can include everybody. Now, speaking of the word everybody, I thought we would take a look at how sometimes it's about sexuality, sometimes marginalized words are about gender. It's not always about that. It's about other types of marginalized identities as well. In this case, we have yoga for everybody. And here we have someone doing a yoga pose. Here we have another yoga pose. There's another one. I can't do any of these very well, but maybe you can. But this is an ad for joining a yoga class. And on Twitter, which I will always call Twitter, just FYI, I asked people on Twitter, how do you feel marginalized or not included in your daily life? And one person said, a friend's yoga class is described as suitable for every body. My body is housebound and actually mostly bedbound. It cannot and should not go to your yoga class. So I've seen phrases like this used a few times in relation to exercises or well-being courses, and I don't feel included, essentially, right? So in this case, yoga for everybody, whose perspective is being centered? Well, it's able-bodied individuals that is being centered here. We're assuming everybody can do yoga, and that's just not the case. And this person is a fine example there. So instead of saying something like yoga for everybody, maybe it's something a little more generic, like beginner yoga. And that might reduce the idea that you have to have a certain type of body to begin it. But again, I think we need to listen to the marginalized group themselves in order to find out what would be a better solution. And this was just one that I heard from some disabled friends of mine. Now, we've looked at gender, sexuality, ability. I'm going to give you another ability one here. 2, actually. And I want you to take a brief read and see if you can figure out what I'm going to talk about. Okay, very quick. The 2 phrases in this case are related to ability. On the left, we can see the expression, tone deaf. And on the right, we can see the expression turn a blind eye. In both of these, we have an idiomatic expression that is trying to suggest something that is not good, right? So in the left case, when we use tone deaf, we're suggesting that somebody is purposely ignoring an important issue or can't read the room in terms of the feelings, right? They're desensitized to how people are actually feeling. And on the right, turn a blind eye similarly has a negative connotation when we do it, right? Because if you turn a blind eye, you're suggesting that you're, again, ignoring maybe a sensitive or a vulnerable group of society or something like that, right? You're purposely making the choice to ignore this thing that you shouldn't ignore. In both cases, disabled people, particularly deaf people or blind people, have highlighted that these phrases are exclusionary. They're marginalizing the disabled community because we're equating a disability with a negative action. And when we do that, we're reinforcing the idea that being disabled is a negative, right? It is a negative quality, and people should not want to be that, or certainly should feel badly about themselves if they are. And this is something that marginalized communities continuously point out, but the larger society, the people in power whose perspectives are being centered, often ignore this because, or they don't even hear or listen to the marginalized communities. And when I point out, for example, on behalf of disabled people, that this is these are phrases that we should probably retire and think about using something different, there becomes this discussion point and backlash throughout society in terms of the people who are in power trying to rationalize that these two things should be continued to be used because they like them, or they express something really well, or they're not really about deaf people or blind people, yada, 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 right? That's the sort of phase that we end up going through before it stops being used eventually. So again, when we think about those four questions, can we start examining the language that we use very commonly and ubiquitously to see whether or not actually these are marginalizing people that we don't even realize sometimes. So again, those four questions: whose perspective is being centered? Can we swap out the language? Does meaning exclude a group of people? Well, absolutely it does in this particular case, right? A blind person can't turn a blind eye. A deaf person can't be tone deaf. Certainly not in the way that we're arguing here, right? Because you have to have the ability to do that. And do you want these things to happen because of the language? Hopefully, the majority of society is not trying to equate disability with a negative, but you never know. So we've done gender, sexuality, ability. There's a couple of other marginalized communities out there. And I want to show you another example of one of them being impacted by the language that we use. This one I'm not going to really reveal to you right off the bat, but I want you to think about it. So this is a very standard sort of apartment kind of ad, right? An ad for an apartment. This is two types of computer drives that are very commonly found in all types of computers. One is the main one, and the other one is a kind of extra storage. And this is a really common golf tournament in the States, although there's lots of international golfers who take part in it as well. These three have the same word in common, actually, and it is a word that is exclusionary. So I'm going to give you a second to think about it. I'll give you a hint. It's not gender, sexuality, or ability. It's something else. Oh, that's a good guess, Beatrice. Is it about socioeconomic status? I wonder. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, it's not in this case about luxurious. Certainly, that's not the one that I'm picking out. It is actually about the word master. In the first case, we have a master bedroom, and there's often a master bath that's related to that. Why is it called a master bedroom and a master bath? Have you ever wondered that? In the second case, we have a master drive and a slave drive. Very commonly used still in computer science today and hardware. The slave drive is the one that does all the sort of extra tasks that the master drive tells it to do, essentially. And then the golf tournament is the Masters tournament, which is a golf tournament that began in the 1800s and has been happening ever since. These are words that we use all the time, and you can even think of the degree that you might have, a master's degree. Why are they called masters? Why do we master something? Where does that derive from? Well, it has racist roots, of course, and it goes back to the time of, particularly the second picture is the easiest to understand, where there were masters of slaves, right? And typically slaves were Black people, or certainly people of color, and masters were white people. When we take a look at even the golf tournament, when it began, it was a golf tournament for masters, and that probably now can change the way you view who that golf tournament was originally for, and who it included and who it didn't include. So here we have this word, master. Is it a word that we need to reconsider? Is it a word that harms or excludes a group of people? Is it a word that centers certain people's experiences and not those of others? Are we trying to exclude people on purpose? And is this something that we should reconsider in the future? These are all questions for you to think about after this session is over. So, as I mentioned, we kind of go through this sort of process in terms of language evolution, right? We have this phrase that's commonly used. It's then either continued to use forever because it's not problematic at all, or it splits and goes into this first category where people like me from a marginalized group are impacted by it, and we try to tell people, hey, please don't use this word, it hurts me. Or it's because of technology or just evolution, it becomes sort of referring to something that doesn't exist anymore. There's a big discussion by people in power as to whether or not it should be continued to use, and people from the marginalized communities continue to advocate for themselves, quite often to people who don't listen. But occasionally we get through and a word stops being used, thankfully, and we get to that last part. Of course, there are situations where there's a kind of third option that ends up happening, and that is that language gets reclaimed or used by its source group to change the power of that word. And I want to show you a couple of examples of that as well, right? First one is the word queer. I am queer, right? I identify as a queer man, particularly gay, but I like the word queer specifically because I like how it is more encompassing and doesn't necessarily only refer to sexuality, but it can refer to gender as well. This word was typically, when I was a kid, used as an insult or a slur, and someone would tease me and call me queer. I would know that they were trying to offend me or to make me feel unvalued. But that has changed over time, and not completely, but the queer community, as I've just referred to it as the queer community, has reclaimed this word and now is trying to reposition it from something that is a slur that you can use to hurt me to now I'm going to use it myself, and it's going to give me power, and it's going to make me feel good about myself. So even if you said the word queer as an insult after today, would never bother me because I love the word queer, right? So this is an example of reclamation. Just on that note, in case we all need to kind of be put onto the same level of understanding, we know that the acronyms that vary in terms of the queer community, as we have lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and non-binary people, these are typically adjectives. There's where the word queer comes in, of course, that Q. Sometimes people call it questioning as well, meaning you don't know, but quite often it's queer. You may see these ones, IA, or you might have a plus sign at the end. That plus sign might include a wide variety of other sexualities or gender identities. In Canada and North America, but more in Canada, I think, we have another category at the front now called 2S, which is two-spirit. It's an Indigenous specific term, so I wouldn't ever use it on myself, but it is referring to a cultural perspective within First Nations or Aboriginal communities where there was a third gender or a different gender that was sort of in between, and it was very much valued, and now is being reclaimed by the Indigenous community. And so we put that acronym at the beginning to I guess center the Aboriginal or the Indigenous perspective within Canada, because that's a thing that's happening now. This idea of queerness is something that can be problematic for some people, as I mentioned, in terms of not only queer people themselves questioning whether or not they like this word, but also just the whole idea of queerness itself can invoke a kind of reaction among people who try to use the word as an insult, realize that it doesn't work as an insult anymore, and sometimes use the word woke, maybe as an alternative, that type of thing. It still comes across in language, even when we're trying not necessarily to sound negative, we can, right? Here's an example of a headline. This is an actor in Heartstopper. I don't know if you've ever seen that TV show. It's on Netflix. It's the best TV show ever, just FYI. So I think you should probably watch it. No hype. But anyway, Kit Connor was at Paris Fashion Week or various places, and he wears, fashionable clothing at these places. And this article's headline says, Kit Connor is down to get freaky with fashion. Now, I don't know if the intention here was to put Kit Connor down and make him feel uncomfortable with his choice, but to get freaky with fashion, or is down to get freaky with fashion, has a sort of negative connotation to it, right? It's not meant to go, well done, we're certainly praising you for this. We're saying, you're kind of weird, and look at you, you can do weird stuff. What an interesting kind of guy you might be, right? The language that is purposely chosen is done so on a reason to exclude. And so not only the ones that we gave examples of earlier on, but even a little bit less obvious types of language phrases can still be meant to exclude. Again, also inadvertently, some people write about marginalized communities by adding their identity to the beginning of their profession, for example, in a way to identify that they are different than everybody else, or at least they're different than the white heteronormative part of society that's in power. So sometimes you get Viola Davis, a black actress, won an Oscar for such and such a thing, or a gay actress, deaf actress, trans actress, and so on. Even by identifying like this, we're putting a spotlight on that community. And while those words themselves are not marginalizing and not negative, and are used, by putting them in front of a person's profession, just as an example, the journalist is trying to show how different or strange that person is compared to everybody else. And so, again, language that is chosen can sometimes be marginalizing, even when it's not so obvious, like master and slave and things like that. As we know, pronouns are sort of the main focus when we're talking about changing language for queer communities. And that gets quite a bit of flack and backlash as well. Here's just an example I found on Facebook, where someone was purposely making fun of the idea that we would include our pronouns as part of our introductions. And there they're trying to obviously make fun of this person's size, which is clearly marginalizing. But as I said, sometimes the communities themselves reclaim the word that is originally meant to use to insult. And Nancy is a word that used to be meant to insult feminine men, perhaps queer men, but quite often feminine characteristics and so on. And you would have words like man up, men don't cry, don't be a Nancy, yada, yada, stuff like that. But now some queer communities, like this podcast, have reclaimed the word Nancy as something to feel powerful about and be proud of feminine characteristics, as opposed to solely masculine. majority people, or people who are quite often marginalized, also react kind of poorly, and we have to be careful of what our reactions are. Bette Midler, great, someone who normally I would love to support, and supports queer communities quite often, heard the word birthing people or menstruators or people with vaginas rather than the word women, and was conflating the use of these terms, these inclusive practices terms, with an idea that queer communities or inclusive practice language practitioners were trying to erase the identity of women. And this, of course, wasn't the case. In medical scenarios, if you refer to people who are pregnant solely as women, it does exclude a group of people who can also be pregnant, like trans men, for example. And so birthing people or menstruators or people with vaginas was a way to medically include a wider variety of people than solely women. It wasn't about invisibilizing women or erasing women's identities in total. But again, even marginalized communities like women themselves can sometimes react negatively to the idea that something they're sensitive about linguistically is being erased. And we have to be cautious as a community, as a society, sort of to think through what the purpose and intention of inclusive language is. Very similarly, this one about greetings for Christmas. We often hear the word season's greetings now, right? Particularly in public situations, rather than Merry Christmas. And a wide group of people who love the word Merry Christmas, or particularly Christians, are quite offended and think that everybody's telling them, don't say Merry Christmas. You can't do that anymore. Now you have to say season's greetings. Well, that's not it at all, right? The inclusive community is only trying to say, there are many holidays that are happening at the same time, and rather than say all of them to every single person, it can be a lot simpler just to say season's greetings. Not that you can't say Merry Christmas. Finally, the last example. Yes.
Sorry, we should start the Q&A in about 5 minutes.
That's fine. The last example I have of this type of language is the word native speaker. Again, think about yourself. Are you a native speaker? Do you identify as one? Am I a native speaker? Who is a native speaker themselves? That itself is a gray area because it kind of depends on a power dynamic. Because in society, particularly in our field, native speakers have traditionally had most of the power when we're talking about English language speakers. And that's just simply stupid because what is a native speaker anyway? And there's so few that we're outnumbered anyway. So English doesn't belong to me. But we can see it in job ads continuously, right? For ELT teachers, number one, native speaker is on this job ad. More so than the experience teaching, right? A minimum of 1 year teaching, but native speaker is more important in this job ad. Again, ridiculous. And we can see the same thing in job ads all over the place. A colleague of mine, Vijay Ramjatan, his work typically revolves around accent and accentism. But again, with regards to his suggestions for the word native speaker, he thinks, and I agree, that we need to move away from policies that highlight monolingualism as an important aspect of language. Stop making native speaker the norm, right? Include social justice as part of any teacher training and representation in course materials, right? So as we get to the sort of end here, as I realize my time's running out, we've looked at a brief historical recap of language use and evolution. We've seen some questions to consider. And finally, I just want to end with, why is this relevant to us? So I'm going to trail through this really quickly. First of all, there are so many people in the world, and in particular, I'm going to talk about Canada right now, that identify as marginalized. In particular, 1.6 million people, that's up 46% from 2011 to 16, identify as Aboriginal. It's a very fast-growing population in Canada. And as you saw, that 2S was an example of one of the calls to action that the governments are being told to do to make the history of Canada better, or at least make up for some of the history of Canada that we've done to the Aboriginal or First Nations people. And I know that in Bolivia, there's like 36 Aboriginal languages, something like that. And I think you're a little bit maybe further ahead than Canada is in this regard. But they're a marginalized group or marginalized groups. According to a couple of polls, there's up to 32% of Gen Z people who identify as part of the queer community. These are people in our classrooms and who are teaching our students. So we need to think about how they're feeling about the way language is being imposed on them. And finally, 16% of the world's population says that they have a significant disability of some sort. That's a large number of people out there. And if we continue to have ableist, racist, sexist, and homophobic or transphobic language that pervades our classrooms, imagine how that's making everybody feel. So I'm going to end there. Thank you very much. And I'm just going to stop sharing for a second so that I can get to the final slide so that you can connect with me. Sorry about that. Oops. Okay, so, whoops. Oh no. There we go. Sorry. I got lost right at the very end, but thank you very much. That's the QR code for the references list. And if you want to get in touch with me, I'm at Seburn on every social, and I quite often use these hashtags. So shouldn't be too difficult to find my work. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Tyson. Well, now it's time for the Q&A session. So if anyone has any questions, you can put them in the chat box or raise your hand. I see Beatriz has her hand raised. So Beatriz.
First of all, thank you so much, Tyson, for accepting our invitation, being here. Sorry to disappoint you, having a virtual event, but promise next time, maybe we're going to have a hybrid one.
Okay.
I heard every single word that you said, and I feel compelled that as an English teacher, I should do something. But at the same time, I'm having this difficulty. Although I don't like to be, and quotation marks here, discriminated because I'm not a native speaker of English, I would like to think that I am good enough to teach the language. But I don't have all the culture. I don't know all the culture. Many of the things that you have mentioned, I can apply to Spanish. And that's a different kind of a struggle and fight. So considering that my students have to deal with their own language, their own culture, and I'm teaching here a different culture and a different language, how do I deal with all this? Do you have any piece of advice?
I don't think that I think it depends on what you're talking about with regards to culture, like the word culture or the idea of culture. I tend to argue that local culture supersedes the culture of another area of the world, even when you're teaching English, because the students that you have typically are probably in your culture, and so share the same culture that you have, unless of course we're talking about international students who come to your area, like in Toronto that might happen. But all of the examples that I give are just examples from my own culture. It isn't tied specifically to English per se. And I think we can use examples from more localized situations to relate to our students. But in terms of marginalized communities and identities, those groups of people exist in every culture, not simply, a Western or a Canadian culture. So even in Bolivia, assuming that's what you're talking about. There are marginalized communities, including queer people, racialized communities, disabled communities, and so on and so forth. And those are the people whom I'm asking to reconsider what language it is that we're using to include those groups of people into our lessons. And so when you're teaching language, English language, it's being aware of the types of English language that you have been taught yourself, and don't even think necessarily are excluding that group of people, that I'm asking you to be more critical of. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Okay, so I see we have a question by Angela Cabana. So, Angela.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you so much, Professor. I've heard all this lecture. It was really nice. And what I think is that collective problems require collective solutions. And is there anything that maybe schools or education industry can do better when it comes to LGBTQ community for teaching in education?
Yeah, for sure. There's lots of things. Certainly there's not the responsibility solely on the teacher, that's for sure. It helps when all the cogs in the wheel of society work together to make change. Obviously, as teachers, we're kind of, I would say, the frontline workers in a sense in this scenario, because we're the ones who directly spend time with our students, more so than your director of studies does or your Ministry of Education and so on do. So you kind of have the first ability to make an impact directly on your students in terms of changing the materials or making them more inclusive. And there are obviously ways to do that. And if you go to this reading list, I have a book actually called How to Write Inclusive Materials that might be really helpful in this case. But for sure, I think the main thing that everybody in society needs to do is just listen to the people in the marginalized communities tell you what it is that is good to help them and what it is that is excluding them. And that is, it sounds simple, but it's something that a lot of people actually don't really do. So going to YouTube or going and watching movies or television shows or clips or reading interviews or magazines by people who are authoring about their own experiences can be a way, of course, to learn what their perspectives are. So if you're not part of the queer community, you have to listen to people in the queer community, and they will be the ones to tell you how to improve things for your students and other people in that community. Same with the disabled community. It's not like they don't exist. It's just people don't tend to pay attention. And so even if you go to Twitter and you want to learn more from the deaf community, there's a deaf community on Twitter that is very willing to talk about their experiences, and you can learn a lot from that. So yeah, it's not just on a teacher's perspective, and yeah, it would be really great if your Ministry of Education would be listening to these communities themselves as well, and people like me and hopefully you and all sorts of other people will just continue advocating until the people in power actually do make some change. But it is slow and it is frustrating sometimes.
Thank you, Professor. What I learned here is that when we speak, we exercise the power of language to transform reality. Thank you so much.
Totally.
Okay, so maybe we can have a very short answer to Fernando's question. He asks, what do you think about globalization and marginalizing other cultures?
That's a good question. It could have lots of answers. I mean, I think there's advantages to globalization, but of course, like anything, there are disadvantages. So, I mean, globalization can lead to a kind of homogenized view of how things need to be done based on whichever group it is that's the most powerful. Like in any scenario, that tends to be the case, right? It's the most powerful that tend to have the largest say. And so in a global perspective, it would be the most powerful areas of society, or countries, if you want to call them that, that would have the biggest influence. So that sometimes not so great. But certainly it can be helpful as well, because when you see what's happening in another area of the world that is positive towards including marginalized identities and communities, and you see that that isn't happening perhaps in another area or your area of the world, you can learn from that. And so very similarly, when I just did a very quick, I don't know, quick's not the right word, that sounds ingenuous, but when I looked about Bolivia's history, specifically with regards to the queer community, I came across a lot of information about the Aboriginal languages, and the laws and things that had happened throughout your history. And of course, I'm no expert. I've never been to Bolivia and I don't know much about it. But I can say I was happy to see some of the things that have been happening, and I related them to my own context in Canada, which is why I was able to say, I think you in some ways are a little bit further ahead with regards to the valuing the Aboriginal languages specifically. So I do think there's an up and down, and probably if we wanted to have a conversation really about this question, we'd have to have a couple of hours.
Yeah, well, this is amazing, but I think this is all the time that we have, so I'm very sorry about that. Again, thank you so much for being able to give this presentation. Again, sorry that it was virtual. I think you will love Bolivia if you ever come here.
I would love to.
And yeah, thank you everyone for participating and being here. And after this, I think we're gonna have the lunch break, if I'm not wrong. So I think we'll go back to the main room. We will have a half an hour break, if I am correct. Beatriz, you can correct me on that if I'm wrong.
Absolutely correct. So
Okay.
we have like 25 minutes for you to stretch, eat something, extra coffee, and we come back. Thank you so much. Yes,
Thank you.
I will reproduce the words of Rosario, really inspirational. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone. See you in 25 minutes.